Hello, everybody. This is Miss Belvedere, and I'm here with part one as we talk about the French Revolution. Okay, so with the French Revolution, we're talking about a different movement or a different revolution aside from the other ones that we've been discussing in class, like absolutism or the Protestant Reformation and so forth. Okay, so here are the standards that I always grade you guys on. So make sure that we're following along the standards. I just want to kind of show that to you right there. I have my notes here, so if I'm looking off to the side, it's because I have some separate notes that I have to talk to you guys about. But as we start off the French Revolution, I want to explain a little bit what is going on before the French Revolution. In France, there is this thing called the Enlightenment that is taking place, and with the Enlightenment, this is a philosophical movement that dominated Europe during the 18th century. Remember, when I say 18th century, I'm really talking about the 1700s, okay? This was a movement, the Enlightenment was a movement that centered around the idea that reason is the primary source of authority and legitimacy. So what does that mean? Is that these different philosophers, they were studying different reasoning about whether, for example, is government necessary? What kind of economic system should we have? Things like that. And so they advocated, or remember, they spoke up about ideas such as liberty, progress, tolerance, government, and separation of church and state. So we're moving past kind of this really, really religious focused kind of system and into a new kind of more progressive system, okay? So to give you guys a little bit of a basis, okay, the American Revolution, when you learn about in U.S. history, the American Revolution took place during 1765 to 1783, okay? So this is the American Revolution. The French Revolution takes place 1789 to 1799. So you can see here that the French Revolution happened just after the American Revolution. So the American Revolution has a lot of influence in sparking the French Revolution. Okay, so make sure to keep track with your guided notes, but between the 1500s and the 1800s, the old feudal order gave way for individual nation states with strong central governments. Monarchs presided over government bureaucracies and enforced the law and collected taxes, and the emergence of strong unified nations occurred at different times in different parts of Europe. So remember kind of when we talked about the feudal system, how there were these little mini kingdoms that they sort of govern their own selves? Well, now think about it, now these are becoming nation states or nations, okay? They used income not only to support this lavish Renaissance courts, but also to strengthen their military power. The rulers of some countries such as Spain and France set up absolute monarchies. Absolute monarchies, this is basically when the person in charge, the king, has complete control. Okay, the system is made up of a ruler that has complete authority over the government and the lives of people. Absolute monarchies often had parliaments or other groups of people that kept them in check, but in reality, these other groups of people, they never really had that much power as opposed to the absolute monarch having total control. So with that said, on this slide, this picture on the right shows perfectly a representation of what people saw as an absolute monarch, someone that completely governs the land and has total control of an area. During this time period, European monarchs embraced the idea of divine right. The word divine right means that they would use the excuse of how God has called them or ordained them to be the ruler of that nation. And so they said, or they would state, I am supposed to be the ruler of this nation because it was told to me from God, it is divine that I would rule this nation. So meaning that the rule authority came directly from God, they used their divine right theory to justify their power. So here's a quote here on the bottom. The royal power is absolute. Without this absolute authority, the king could neither do good nor repress evil. It is necessary that his power be such that no one can escape him. So this quote is basically saying like divine right. They're completely ordained by God to rule that nation, and not necessarily true, right? So with the good of the people. So here on the right side, you can actually see this is a real picture of the crown that King Louis XVI had during the French Revolution. You can kind of see here how lavish and how sort of extra it is, right? Absolute monarchs who claimed to rule by divine right were expected to act for the good of their people, but in the 1700s, absolute monarchs reigned over most of the great powers in Europe, except for England. So this whole idea of divine right, this is becoming widely popular in England, okay? So let's talk about France in particular, okay? So with France, on April 28th, 1789, unrest exploded at the Paris wallpaper factory, a rumor that spread that the factory owner was planning to cut wages even when bread prices were soaring. So this is kind of the basis of the French Revolution. The French Revolution is an economic struggle that then explodes to be a social issue. And so what was happening was that people, shop owners or employers, they were cutting the pay or the wages that people were receiving at their jobs. So they were receiving less money, but at the same time, there was an inflation or there was an increase of pay that took place in the kind of nation itself. And so bread and other food sources, they were starting to cost more, while people's income, they were starting to receive less money. So you could see kind of the unrest of the people. Enraged workers vandalized the owner's home and then rioted through the streets. The rioting reflected growing up unrest in Paris and throughout France. In 1789, France faced not only an economic crisis, but also widespread demands for far-reaching changes. Okay? So in July, people were starting to freak out. They were basically saying, we can't afford this. Why are you cutting our wages when obviously food is costing more money? By July, the hungry, unemployed, poorly paid people of Paris were taking up arms against the government, a movement that triggered the French Revolution, okay? So kind of to give you an idea, we're looking at this date right here to sort of put in your mind in perspective, like what time period are we talking about? If you guys remember, what year did we sign the Declaration of Independence? 1776, right? And so we're kind of sort of in the same zone or the same time period. To set the stage, the French Revolution is based on the fact that the distribution of wealth was unfair and taxation from the government was out of control. So this picture, it looks kind of silly here on the left, but I'm going to explain here in a second in the next few slides how the social structure was set up during this time and why this picture makes sense, okay? So here on the top two, we have the first and second estate. So the first estate was made up of what was called the clergy, okay? The second estate was the nobility, and then the third estate is most of the population or the people. So this picture, this is a political cartoon kind of depicting the power that these groups had. So in 1789, France, like the rest of Europe, still clung to an outdated social system that emerged in the Middle Ages. To give you an idea, if you guys remember when we talked about the feudal system and how peasants, right? Oops, let's see. Maybe I can spell. How peasants were on the bottom of this hierarchy, if you guys remember, and they could never move their way up. This is basically the same thing, just with another title, the first, second, and third estate. So I'm going to explain each one of those, okay? So the clergy, this makes up 1% of the population. The clergy represents basically the church people, okay? So we have here high church leaders such as bishops, who were usually nobles who lived very well. The French clergy still enjoyed enormous wealth and privilege, and the church owned about 10% of the land, collected tithes, and paid no taxes to the state, okay? So the clergy, this is 1% of the people, all right? They did not have to pay taxes. They basically also took the tithes from the church. They made up 10% of the land, okay? And the clergy still enjoyed enormous wealth and just lavish lifestyles. So high church leaders such as bishops, They lived very well. The First Estate did provide some social services, so you had nuns, monks, and priests that ran schools and hospitals and orphanages. But during the Enlightenment, philosophers targeted the church and said, like, having this much power in the church, this is not good. So the First Estate, otherwise known as the clergy, okay? The Second Estate, this is called the nobility, and the nobility makes up 2% of the population. Now, the nobility, this is kind of a situation that's a little bit funny, but the nobility is not necessarily royalty, but it's about one step below royalty, and it's kind of like the entourage that was with the royal people. So the Second Estate was titled the Nobility of French Society. In the Middle Ages, noble kings had defended the land. They had a lot more power, or maybe like more roles that were more precise during the Middle Ages. But later on, these kind of just turned into what was known as sort of the royal entourage. This is the level just below royalty, not a part of royal family, but also important. Okay? Many ambitious nobles came to hate absolutism, which is what we learned about in the previous unit, and resented the royal bureaucracy that employed middle class people in positions that once had been reserved for them. So they wanted to keep their privileges the whole time, and they wanted to continue these lavish lives. These people also did not pay taxes, okay? 2% of the people. Then, if you do the math, okay, my math people, 1 plus 2%, that's only 3%. The rest is the Third Estate, which makes up 97% of the population. From middle class to peasantry. This is also known, so if I broke it up here, there's kind of two sections of the peasantry section, okay? You have the top, so say that this is the peasant kind of box. The top half, this is called the bourgeoisie, okay? The bourgeoisie. Now I know that you guys have seen that meme that's like, the birds work for the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie, this is like the higher upper class, or higher peasantry class, the higher middle class section. Maybe some of us in class, we would be considered bourgeoisie because we're still people that have to work, but we do live kind of on the higher end of society maybe, okay? Or middle class. So this would be bankers, merchants, manufacturers, as well as lawyers, doctors, journalists, and professors. The bottom bulk, these are your total, like what we think of peasants. These are landowners who hired laborers to work for them, other farmers or day laborers. This is the poorest of the Third Estate, okay? Urban workers who did coal mining or printing or cloth making. Large people were unemployed and survived through begging or also crime in this time. So the Third Estate, 97%, okay? So bourgeoisie on the top, kind of the peasantry on the bottom. Now, discontentment. So from rich to poor, members of the Third Estate resented the privileges enjoyed by social betters. Urban workers earned miserable wages. Even the smallest rise of the price of bread, which was their main source of food at this time, brought the threat to greater hunger and starvation. Now, we're going to see this theme a lot during the French Revolution of bread, okay? Bread is the cheapest food that you can access with the highest amount of calories. So if you're trying to just get calories for energy to work and you don't have a lot of money because your wages have been cut, bread is your best option. And so when we see the price of bread, this is what it's talking about. This brought the threat of great hunger and even starvation. In 1775, before the French Revolution, peasants rioted for the high price of bread in what was an event called the Flour War. So how much is everything? This is going to be the end of part 1 here, and then we're going to follow along with part 2. This is a coin here on the right side called a sou, but stay tuned for part 2, okay? Good work.